Hello, my name's Adrian Goldberg and welcome to the Byline Times podcast. The Byline Times telling you what the papers don't say and what telly doesn't tell you. This time, reaction to the Daniel Morgan report. An independent panel chaired by Baroness Nuala O'Loan has finally published its findings after an 8-year investigation into the circumstances surrounding Daniel's unsolved murder outside a South London pub in 1987. Its key finding is a momentous one, identifying institutional corruption at the heart of Britain's most powerful police force, the Met, just as Sir William Macpherson had identified institutional racism in the same force in 1999 when he examined the Stephen Lawrence murder inquiry. Daniel was a private investigator whose company, Southern Investigations, had close links to newspapers, including Rupert Murdoch's News of the World. It's a tale of police corruption, media interference, and political intrigue. You can listen to previous episodes of this podcast where we explain more about the history of the case and carry an in-depth interview with Alastair Morganwho, Daniel's brother, who has fought for justice for 34 years. This week, though, we're getting more or less instant reaction to the report from Byline TV with Alastair, who you'll hear from shortly, and his partner Kirstine Knight. First, though, Byline Times editor Hardeep Matharu and Peter Jukes, whose podcast about the case, Untold, has had 9 million downloads. Like everything we do at Byline, Byline TV doesn't have a media mogul or corporate backer behind it. It relies on people like you, so please support its Patreon appeal. Just put Byline TV Patreon into your search engine. Right then, over to Peter.
Hardeep, you were there yesterday with me. We were locked into this room at 9:15 and these 3 volumes came out and we had a couple of hours to read them before the chair of the panel, Baroness Nuala O'Loan, spoke, and so did the family. But you're fairly new to this story. I've been working on it maybe 10 years, obviously the family for 34 years. What was yesterday like for you?
Well, I think it was quite a momentous day for the country, to be honest. So in terms of that report, the panel said that they went through 110,000 documents containing over 1 million pages, and it had taken the panel 8 years, 34 years since the murder of Daniel Morgan, which remains unsolved. No one's ever been convicted. £16 million.
Just for this panel report. That's not the other investigations.
And the conclusion is the Metropolitan Police is institutionally corrupt in terms of how it protects its own reputation rather than the transparency it offers around its culture and its practices and corrupt police officers. And the report made clear that, this rotten apple approach towards the Met Police is a complete fallacy. It is a systemic failure on many levels. And the panel said it's not historic. This is something that is currently a problem for the Met Police. It's the largest force in the United Kingdom. It's London's police force, but it also has a number of national level powers. And it was a sort of a landmark moment. And what was interesting was the chair of the panel, when asked, said, is this equivalent in importance, this finding, as the 1999 Macpherson inquiry finding of institutional racism within the police, which we know, of course, was as a result of the Stephen Lawrence murder? And she said, yes, this is a really serious problem. So that was a very interesting development, I think, in police, in terms of policing in this country and the repercussions that it has, that we've now moved from institutional racism, we've now moved to something, arguably even more wide-ranging, which is institutional corruption. And for me, I thought the Met Police response was completely staggering. So very sort of quickly afterwards, we went to a press conference, which was given by the Assistant Commissioner, not Cressida Dick, the Met Police Commissioner herself. And he said, well, according to what I see every day on the job, as it were, I kind of see the opposite. I don't really see institutional corruption within the Met Police day to day. And he also said something which was quite sort of odd, I thought, which was, he said, well, this is a new term that's been coined. People aren't familiar with it. We'll have to read the report and look at what these assertions are based upon. And I think the third point that I'd come to really is a wider point about the state. So you have this report, which is saying institutional corruption, almost immediately the Met Police is saying, no, we don't really recognise that. We don't recognise that. And if there is anything, it was sort of historic in the 70s and 80s, dodgy cops. We've moved on from that quite a lot. And I'm sure there have been developments. But a notion that, no, there isn't, this problem isn't really a thing. And I think it raises really sort of significant questions about the British state. You know, why is Britain a country that is so bad at turning the mirror on itself and facing up to its systemic issues?
Well, the subtitle for this show was, Is Britain Institutionally Corrupt? And we shall talk to Alastair and Kirstine about that very, very shortly. One thought I had, though, when I heard that, you know, bad apple theory, is it was very much like, you know, I'm a good guy. He spoke in this management speak,
This is the Assistant Commissioner,
yes.
Nick F. Grave.
F. Grave. I'm a good person. I see good people around them. And I have a reverse theory, is the good apple theory. Well, all I see is good apples. But the tree's broken and corrupt and about to fall down. But it's got one good apple. And it's this misunderstanding, isn't it, which we'll talk about with Alastair and Kirstine. Institutional corruption isn't about removing the commissioner, or there's a good person or a bad person, or we're honourable chaps, a bit like the government, but we're good government. It's about the dysfunction within the system itself. I think that's a wider point, isn't it? That's what you've been sort of, you discovered, especially your work on empire, your work on racism, that in a way, you know, this inability to face up to the truth about ourselves.
Yeah, and power, you know, and how do we confront power in this country? Where does it really lie? You know, what do we do when it is corrupting the very functions of the state, when it's leaving people without justice, when it's ruining people's lives, when it's potentially allowing a private detective to be murdered, you know, in a pub car park with an axe?
Well, more than that, allowing his detective agency to be taken over and be used, in the words of the panel report, and they're quite strong on that, as a hub of corruption for 20 years. One
thing before we chat to Alastair and Kirstine is very, I mean, you've written, obviously you've done your podcast on this very subject, but you also wrote Who Killed Daniel Morgan, a book about the case with Alastair Morgan. And one of the things that I found really striking about it was towards the end of the book, you sort of explore why it's never been forthcoming in this case, this finding of institutional corruption, or, you know, why the Met Police has never wanted to really acknowledge that there may be corruption which goes beyond a few bad apples. And it was really interesting that you observed that actually that is just such a big thing for the police and the state and the government to take on. So whereas institutional racism was a landmark that we reached, perhaps that was, in a way, something that was more feasible to deal with than saying that the very function of the Met Police is completely undermined, that it is, in some way, it's corrupt within itself. It's just too big a concept for the state to take on.
Well, Raju Bhatt, the family's lawyer, made the very good point. There's no hierarchy of sickness. But in a way, institutional corruption, you know, racism is a form of corruption, which would affect people of colour in cases against them. If it's institutionally corrupt, there's no candour, there's no truth, then the criminal justice system falls apart, because it relies on honest police officers giving evidence in court against alleged criminals. And so I think it does. I think it affects its core function in a much more devastating way, and therefore is more difficult to accept than racism on its own. And I think, as we'll explore and discover later, this is endemic throughout Britain, whether it's in Parliament about, you know, ministerial code, you know, contracts. So, but before we get there, should we just have a look and see what the panel actually said? So we'll see now the panel chair, Baroness O'Loan, followed by the response of Raju Bhatt, the family's lawyer.
The family of Daniel Morgan has suffered grievously as a consequence of the failure to bring his murderer or murderess to justice. The unwarranted assurances which they were given, the misinformation which was put into the public domain, and the denial of failings in the investigation, including failings to acknowledge professional incompetence, individuals' venal behaviour, and managerial and organisational failures. We believe that concealing or denying failings for the sake of an organisation's public image is dishonesty on the part of the organisation for reputational benefit. This constitutes a form of institutional corruption.
As Daniel's family, we became aware of the police corruption at the heart of this matter within 3 weeks of the murder. We said so then, and we have had to say so repeatedly over the decades since the murder. Through those decades, we had to engage in public protests, meetings with police officers at the highest ranks, lobbying of politicians and pleas to the media. At almost every step, we found ourselves lied to, fobbed off, bullied, degraded, and let down time and time again. What we were required to endure was nothing less than torture, and that has changed our relationship with this country forever.
And now we're joined by Alastair Morgan and his partner, Kirsty Knight, who have been dedicated to getting justice for Daniel Morgan for the past 34 years. Thank you both for being here with us tonight. How are you feeling today?
Relieved, I suppose, is one of the emotions. Relieved. I feel vindicated to a large extent, which is a huge relief. And also I can feel that this is something that's quite historic, that what we've done with this, or let's say what the panel have done here. And I've been listening most of today to comments about from the police. I heard an interview with Lord Blair earlier on the radio, and I'm pondering the reactions of the police in particular to this accusation or this finding of institutional corruption. And I think what they're getting very, should we say, upset about is that their conception of corruption is very, very narrow. You know, it's brown envelopes, etc., that kind of thing. And the panel's interpretation of corruption is, well, I mean, if you take the police's foundation, you know, policing by consent and the constable's oath to police without fear or favour, dishonesty is a direct perversion of that purpose. And dishonesty is something that we've experienced from the police over decades.
Were you expecting that finding of institutional corruption?
I was hoping for it. Because let's not forget that here we had a brutal murder in which there was an allegation of police involvement. In my view, a perfectly credible and credible allegation of police involvement. Now, when this, and I'll add here that there was a prescient element to the allegation, in other words, well, which I won't go into here for legal reasons because it's a difficult and tricky area. But this was a very, very serious allegation. In other words, that there was police involvement in a brutal contract murder by all accounts, and I mean something is extremely. It's hard to imagine anything more serious than that. And then juxtaposed with that very serious allegation, we have an inquiry, an initial inquiry, which is so important, that is derided almost by the panel. It was so pathetic. Various aspects were described as pathetic, incompetent, etc., etc. And then in the course of this investigation, there was an internal inquiry which whitewashed it, an internal Met inquiry, followed by an outside inquiry, so supposedly independent by another police force, which also whitewashed this inquiry, whitewashed the first inquiry. Now, for many, many years afterwards, this was the basis on which the police commented on the case. You know, the Hampshire inquiry said it was, I don't know the word, I can't remember the words, but vigorous and thorough and honest and all these sort of complimentary adjectives were used about it, which were completely false, as was the internal inquiry.
And so you knew, in terms of as a family, very quickly after Daniel was murdered, that this was an institutional systemic problems were apparent, that this wasn't just a bit of incompetence, a bit of a bungled investigation or two. This was systemic. And so why do you, and I'll ask you as well, Peter, I mean, why do you think then it's taken the Metropolitan Police so long on this systemic point, that it's systemically there is corruption?
Heidi, before you get to that, just to explain about, I think, the independence, I think because like Alastair and ourselves, we probably read less of the report than most people because we've been locked in studios and doing articles. I think it's pretty clear cut on those early findings, right? They have said they have found no evidence of involvement in the murder itself.
Of police involvement.
Of police involvement in the actual planning, if you like, of the murder. I mean, there's stuff we can talk around that. But the second thing they do say then that there was a lot of incompetence, but they do indicate that corruption, a particular involvement of a detective, could have tended to make that inquiry not work. But the clear finding I think I've read is that it turned out the independent Hampshire investigation, the PCA, Police Complaints Authority, wasn't independent because the liaison officer from the Met was running things. I don't know if you've come.
Absolutely, and it goes far beyond that. I mean, there was basically collusion it's very complicated and we need to absorb the details of this fully, but one of the suspects that was arrested, though was completely not guilty, was brought in for slightly strange reasons, but this person knew a lot about the murder and had actually said to one of the officers while he was in the cell that he was happy to talk to them sort of confidentially about a firm within the firm, and he knew much more about the involvement. That piece of information was never followed up. It was never put into the Holmes system. But they know from finding notebooks that it was known about and nothing was done about it. And that was about police corruption.
So
police involvement in the murder.
Yeah.
So the firm, just to explain to people, that the firm within a firm, that's the old sort of term for a corrupt network of officers. I haven't thought.
No, and the reason I'm not explaining it very well is it is very complicated and we need to sit down and properly read that line by line. But as you say, because we've just been doing so many interviews.
Just on that too, I mean, it's very difficult, police involved in the murder. What Alastair's talking about is the inquest, aren't you, where it was alleged.
Well, prior to this, the statement was made probably 6 months before the inquest.
That's right, and of a bookkeeper who was,
closely involved with the company.
Closely involved with the company, spoke to members of the company and said the murder's being planned and the local police officers will help clear it up. So, but that is quite difficult, isn't it? Is that involvement in the actual murder or providing the course of justice afterwards? So I finding some of their decisions, I have to read it to understand where they come from. So that's the first two ones, just to clarify that thing. So, but we're finding out new things all the time.
I mean, the Met response has been eye-opening, and I mean, lots of people have commented that it reinforces the very findings of the report, because one, Cressida Dick has not been forthcoming. I don't know whether she's reached out to yourselves.
No, they keep talking about having apologised to us.
Well, she has apologised.
Well,
I heard earlier today, I was told by a journalist that she'd apologised.
Yes, but that's how we hear about it,
is
through a journalist, not actually to Alastair.
That is staggering, again.
Or the wider family.
But the Assistant Commissioner, I mean, a press conference we attended shortly after the report's release, I mean, Nick F-Grade was saying that, based on what he sees every day in his job, he sees the opposite. Lots of officers out there being selfless, and that institutional corruption isn't something that resonates with him.
Well, nobody's arguing that there are lots of great officers.
No. I am convinced, right, that there are many, many thousands of police officers in this country who are very brave, diligent, courageous, and straight, no corruption. And I've never ever thought otherwise, you know. But and Nick Effgrave may well be right in the fact that he, you know, this is what he sees. But that and the kind of corruption that we've seen here are they're very separate things. You know, it's not like, I mean, if it does affect these officers, it's the leadership. It's the fact that they, like the thing that they brought up in Line of Duty, where people are allowed to, if you like, where corruption is allowed to prosper by the senior ranks. And I think this case, it's a question of leadership that has been lacking right from the very start. I mean, you had this very, very serious situation which I described earlier. Now, any sane commissioner would be thinking, we have to clear this up. If we want to draw a line in the sand against corruption, this is so serious that it has to be dealt with. We've got no choice. But then what do you get? A pitiful inquiry.
Also, that whole problem is, you know, if you have a wound and it's corrupt, and you just gloss over it, oh, it's all fine, then it really festers and involves the system. So, I mean, just the difference of corruption is, Alastair says, the brown envelopes, or, I mean, you know, by the 90s, they mentioned 10 officers in and out of Southern investigations, all done for quite serious crimes. So we're talking about fitting up people with drugs, we're talking taking money, you know, really serious crimes done by officers around that. And then you have this other bit where they won't look at it. Now, some of that, I think, is just embarrassment, isn't it? You know, oh gosh, we don't want to talk about that. But some of it's shady. I mean, the other bit, I still haven't read, but I got to Operation Two Bridges, Nigeria, and I thought, where's this section? That's the third investigation, conducted by the Anti-Corruption Command, CIB3, their Ghost Squad, famously very like Line of Duty. There's nothing on that. Well, it's just like, it doesn't happen.
One thing I don't think has really been picked up by the press yet, and I have yet to read it in the report, but I know we both know from long talking to the panel about this, we were totally misled. You will see lots of clippings everywhere talking about 5 murder investigations. Well, that's what we thought, 5 murder investigations. It was not. That's wrong.
That wasn't a murder investigation?
That wasn't a murder investigation.
You were told it was?
We were told it was, quite clearly, and I'm sure there is a particular officer that is criticised in that report for
misleading us.
Willfully misleading. I mean, I've got all the notes from those meetings with them about what we were told, and it was that it was a murder investigation.
But it never was. It was just
never
the
was.
intelligence.
But if I'm right, that sort of intelligence gathering sort of operation, it revealed a lot of criminality that was going on in and around Southern investigations. And I think, having come to this story relatively recently, one of the things that is just so chilling to me is that it's not just about policing, it's about the whole criminal justice system, where you've got a situation where, you know, private detectives and police officers, former police officers, are getting involved in prosecutions and talking to judges and tampering with witnesses. That's the whole criminal justice system potentially being compromised.
I don't know if this is explored in the report, but certainly my feeling, and I think Alastair's as well, is around what was going on in the third I was going to say murder investigation, but of course now we know it wasn't. And you're right, some very good information did come out about that. But I've always wondered, at least, if the motivation at that time for finding out about that corruption was actually because the stories at that time that Southern investigations were selling to the press were very often about police corruption, is whether they had become at that point so much of a thorn in the Met's side that what the motive may have been for that investigation was not to solve the murder, as we know now. It wasn't a murder investigation, but to shut Southern investigations down.
It would make sense very much. There's John Stevens was the commander. He's just John Stevens at that time. I think he was a deputy assistant. I'm not sure if he was the actual commissioner at that point. And he writes about this phase, Operation Nigeria 2 Bridges, where they put a bug in. So boasts about it. And then, weirdly, and he's criticised the report for this and recommendations made about senior officers, goes to work with its main employer, Southern Investigations News of the World. It's a very, you're right, it's like there's some almost damage. That's what I feel about the 90s when you get to, it's called Operation Orthona and all that scoping out. They try another major anti-corruption push, don't they? They're investigating it, but kind of to turn it around, not get rid of it.
It's corruption management.
Yes, exactly. And that's a kind of corruption.
We're talking about sort of rotten apples and many good policemen as well. I just want to touch a bit on Dave Cook, who, against my knowledge, was put in charge of the, what would you call it now, the third and fourth investigations?
Fourth and fifth.
Well, not anymore.
Not anymore.
No, you've got to
The
change
corruption
your number.
management needs to be taken
Of course,
into account.
third and fourth.
And they call it Morgan 2, Part 1 and 2. You know,
It all gets very
Yeah, now
confusing.
he was someone who, I'm sure everyone knows the story, but he was originally brought on, he was fronting a crime watch sort of appeal for more information, but then he actually became involved in the investigations. He himself and his wife, surveillance vans were sent to camped outside, following them around.
They were hacked.
The phone hacking was going on, which is sort of linked to News of the World. How do you feel about how he has come out in this report? And I mean, it seems like the panel is saying that even if it's sort of for a noble cause, he was also sort of doing things that came under being corrupt. I mean, but you've also said he's the only officer that you ever really trusted.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, having described my own view of the first two investigations, laughable, well, not laughable, the very opposite, in fact, but I mean, pathetic. Corrupt whitewashing, yeah? Internal and external whitewashing. When I remember, in our conversations with the police, where obviously our biggest concern in this was police involvement, a terrifying thought that, my brother had been assassinated with the help of the British state, or a member, if you like, or an official of the British state. Sorry.
Dave Cook was a breath of
he was
fresh
a
air.
breath of fresh air, because we could actually talk about our feelings and our fears and our suspicions and the reasons why we held these suspicions with him. And he was not like, prior to this, for God knows how long, 15 years, it was, what? Police involvement? Or,
No, I mean, they recoiled whenever you used the C corruption word.
And it was the same with my mother. We got this, you're crazy. Or not, those words weren't used, but it was, you're crazy, you know what I mean? Or, let's not talk about that, and then they'd start trying to point the finger at other people and all that. Whereas our, most worst case scenario and the most fearful for us was that the police were involved in the murder. And it changed when Dave Cook came along, and it was like, oh my God, thank God for that. We can actually express our feelings and our anxieties and our fears openly without being ridiculed or rejected or,
And he would quite often disagree with you and say, no, this isn't realistic, Alastair, and this is why. But it was the first time, with the exception, we should say there was an officer before called David Zinzan, who was also very reasonable, thoughtful, and did his best, and he deserves credit. But Dave Cook really did take it on. He'd seen corruption in the police before, and he was not allergic to the idea. So that was very different.
Cool. There was no that sort of attitude. Corruption, no such thing. That's the sort of attitude that has sort of radiated out from the Metropolitan Police.
And Peter, what exactly, just take us through very quickly, what happened in terms of Dave Cook? I mean, there was this intimidation by News of the World, but what happened afterwards? And there was some allegations that he had inappropriate contact with a witness. And
So there's a very interesting, and there is criticism of the senior officers managing him, because he had another job, I think, at SOCA, didn't he? So he basically is the front man for a covert operation run by Zinzan. and he immediately gets targeted. This because of the situation, a family situation. His wife, Jackie Hames, also a police officer, Crime Watch presenter, had been close to Jill Dando, who'd been assassinated, looks like, on her doorstep 3 years before. The threats to the family were very severe. I mean, they felt them very strong. You know, they knew, it's like, you know, if you know you're being followed by a photographer, that's one thing. When you know there are very bad gangsters, murderers involved in this case, and there's threats, you know, police corruption involved, it came on very top. It did, you know, I think Dave's talked about it, Jackie Hames has certainly talked about it, destroy their marriage. And so there is a duty of care that Met towards Dave Cook, that he does take over, and he does a scoping exercise for London, the Metropolitan Police Authority, and they go, we can build another case from there. And it's a very complicated case. He's directly confronted with a shotgun at one point. And they are arrested, 5 suspects, in 2008. And things do go wrong. There's no doubt, and Dave Cook was the first to admit, he gets too close to a super grasping, quite how the defence knew what they knew and why the phone records don't show what they show. But I still think, I just say one thing. I am in this report 3 pages because Dave Cook was, after the trial collapsed, I think with other journalists, he felt had a duty of candour to the public to get some of this out. I am of a mind, there's like 20, I don't know, a whole half volume about him. And the suggestions he's part of that noble corruption, noble cause. He was off the right, he did things wrong, right? But I find it amazing they put that in the same framework of the things they don't investigate about News of the World. We don't have Leveson to. We know that the Mirror group, for example, of 261 crimes they detected in the 6 months they had to bug in, 70% were from the Mirror. That's all just said there. Dave Cook gets this whole section about him and what he did wrong, and talking to journalists like me and Glenn Campbell of the BBC and whether they should be prosecuted with that. I will say now here, this is my opinion, as Christine might not agree with me. From what I know about Dave Cook and how he's helped journalists for the public interest, this panel wouldn't have existed without him.
I'm not sure. I mean, I believe Dave Cook played a significant role in exposing the phone hacking scandal. And I never ever felt in my communications with him that there was anything shifty or dishonest or manipulative about him at all. So I think it's a great shame. And the way he was treated, you know, there was this awful incident that you just described, the surveillance and all of that. And it was just like the Met hang him out, you know, just isolated him. In fact, it wasn't even investigated.
No, it wasn't investigated.
But he was repeatedly investigated.
Yes.
Various.
And I think that's another strand of convenience. Now, I am not going to defend everything Dave Cook did, and I do genuinely believe in his case, everything he did in what he thought to be the best way or the only way of advancing justice. But you have to be very careful in defending noble corruption more widely, because very often you can argue that that officers that fitted up black people with drugs thought that they were doing the right thing. They think that is the guilty person, so I am going to fit them up. And that is the greater good. And that can't be tolerated. I need to read the report, the fine details on the relationship with the media, and I'm being biased here as a journalist. I think to criminalise all leaking to journalists would be worrying, because leaking can be in the greater good as well. But I need to read the details on what they're saying about that. And obviously, if someone's doing it for money or for a book deal, that puts a more questionable spin.
Right, just so I have to declare, because in that report, I've never mentioned of money when Dave Cook has helped, and not from this case. This is all after he's left the force, all after things collapsed, things like the Mazda Mahmood documentation. Never any question of money. But I find that just very odd. I mean, maybe it's just the limits, the remit of the panel, that there is a whole half volume on him and very little on News of the World.
It's quite a
Well,
philosophical...
it's partly practical.
Yeah.
They can get documents and people would speak to them. Dave Cook would speak to them. I'm sure Alex Maranchak and other journalists did not.
And it's really interesting, that point you just make, Kirsten, because it's quite a philosophical point, really, that noble cause corruption is still corruption. And yet, again, it's interesting, isn't it? Because obviously there's been institutional corruption for so long that...
It's about weighing the proportion of...
I think the thing is, I'm not making a judgment of what he did wrong with the Supergas or anything like that. There are some misrepresentations of why the child collapsed. It's more the activities afterwards when he's left, which seem to be a whole half volume, and that does seem disproportionate. But also, you're right, in the limit of the remit of the panel, because they had no power. Alastair and Kirstine were hoping for Leveson too, weren't you? Which did have the Inquiries Act behind it and did have bites.
I would have found out a lot more about journalists and investigations.
And was part of the decision-making process when the panel system was offered to us by the Home Secretary Theresa May, and whether we should continue to battle for a judicial inquiry. One of the big reasons you went for this, ironically now after 8 years, is the panel was thought to be a lot quicker than a judicial inquiry. But also we knew that with the panel we would lose the powers of that a judicial inquiry had, and therefore they wouldn't be properly able to investigate the media side of this.
So can I just clarify this, because I did have a big debate with David Allen Green about this. He said, this was always seen as a substitute for Leveson too, but that was never in your mind. It was quite the opposite.
No. The Prime Minister Cameron had promised Leveson too, and in my mind, when I thought about the media criminality surrounding, all infusing in this case, I thought, well, the panel lacks statutory powers, but Leveson too will have statutory powers, and if there are any outstanding issues, important issues that the panel can't get to, then Leveson too will be there to pick up the pieces and
therefore
make
part
sense
of your decision for
that
accepting
was
a panel
inquiry.
inquiry.
And the panel meant that, witnesses can't be compelled to give
Yeah,
evidence.
absolutely.
Yeah, exactly. And I remember writing to Theresa May about this, that my disappointment when, was it Matt Hancock?
Matt
Hancock was in charge of getting
and said that Lord Justice Leveson had agreed that there shouldn't be, when he had not.
Which is something Priti Patel, the Home Secretary,
It's repeated
in
today, isn't it?
Yeah.
Oh,
this week in response to the report.
What do you call institutional corruption? The same kind of thing, lying.
So that's interesting, isn't it?
Yeah.
That's what you felt this a bit, the duty of candour, when you put it down to being honest, makes much more sense. It sounds otherwise a bit. But that's why I see this spreading throughout the whole state, like the ministerial code, lying in Parliament, contracts.
Yeah, I was going to ask, to what extent is Britain still an imperial Britain? When I asked that question, what's your response to that?
My response to that is that I think the police's actions in this case are a kind of imperialist type action. I remember hearing a black QC talking about this at a meeting I went to several years ago, and he was saying that because we don't have any colonies anymore, the police use the same, they use we are now the subjects of imperialist policing, a kind of mindset where, we can't let the natives know that, that would be bad. Any kind of misdeeds by the imperial state, we can't let them know about that, or crimes, if you like, that sort of thing. It wouldn't be good for them to know about this. And that, I think that mentality is still there.
So
or the public mustn't know about, this particular case, the lying that went on about it, misleading ministers, misleading MPs, first and foremost us, but then even misleading Parliament, where a minister would stand up and say, The commissioner tells me that the first inquiry was up to the standards of the day, and the Hampshire inquiry found this, this, and this. Rubbish, complete rubbish, being pumped into our parliamentary system.
It's all predicated on power that is unaccountable.
Yeah.
But it also kind of suits whichever government is in power at the time. They were being told what they wanted to hear, and it isn't in their interest to dig too much deeper, because there is this sense among the police and government that somehow the country would collapse if we admitted that not all our institutions were perfect and that mistakes were made. This is all it would have taken.
Didn't Baroness O'Loan say something like that? We're not very good at admitting where we go wrong. But my question to you, because before I met Alastair, I had a slightly rosier idea of the police. I'd worked a lot on cop shows, but mainly outside London forces. And it's kind of sort of slightly jaded my opinion there. But I'll have this existential problem. Isn't the Met, that's its thing, that it's a local constabulary with all that sort of powers to policing by consent and without fear or favour, the constable's vow. But because it also works for the Home Office, it's a form of the FBI. It's a national force. It was sent up to police the miners' strike and on overtime, and has these powers like counter-terrorism and undercover and things like that. That it's too convenient, an unaccountable arm of the state. Because the Home Office, you just use the Met for whatever you want. They even Labour, but they all like this sort of dual nature of it. But that's the nature of its actual existential corruption, because it's not what it pretends to be.
And people often, we talk about, we're having more conversations about empire in this country now, and people often say, well, one of the good things is that the British took law and order to these countries. But law and order was often used as a tool to control populations. And I think, yesterday, I thought it was a landmark moment. And I think one of the things that was in the back of my mind was, why do more people not know about Operation Legacy, which was the state-sanctioned burning, putting into the bottom of the sea, getting rid of, shredding of many of the documents from our former colonies as they gained independence. That was all of that paperwork was destroyed, because the government said, we can't have anything embarrassing ever emerging about this. And in that sense, what has really moved on?
But
it's really interesting.
In that sense, there really are great similarities, because I think a lot about this is about the state not being able to look at its own image honestly. This sense of British police, the greatest police in the world. I'm not saying it's a bad police force, but it's this illusion that it's the greatest, and the inability to question when things go wrong.
I think as well, that kind of propaganda image of Britain, world beat, we've had it recently, world beating. And Britain is very, very good at certain things. Some of the things that, for example, the production of vaccine, very, very top-class scientists and things like that. But that we're, this sort of idea that we're the best in the world at everything is the kind of idea that particularly the global Britain, all of these kind of images, which are deceptive. At the moment we're the only country, probably G7 country, that's got a free trade area smaller than our own borders now. As a result, that is comical. You have to laugh at that. You have to laugh at that.
So there's a deception at the heart of the state about itself.
A failure to confront reality.
And this is the appeal of our current Prime Minister, who I think comes out of this corruption. Not only did he comment about phone hacking, saying it's cooked up left-wing codswallop, but he has been backed by those very papers who stopped Leveson too. Their mates, they back him, those three key paper groups. And they all, here's a great story of English exceptions, and we are great at creating stories and hiding the truth by those stories. And until we wake up and meeting Alastair for the first time was like meeting the ancient mariner. You know? He stoppeth one of three, and he starts telling this story of this sort of amazing story, which is unbelievable and difficult to follow. And but we, I much prefer that. Reality. It's the two pills, isn't it? It's the red pill, the blue. Would you like to live the illusion of this Great Britain with nice Dixon of dock green coppers, or will you take? I think it's the red pill and see the reality. These guys with the red pill.
I think, there's another saying, it's better to be slapped by the truth than kissed by a lie. That's another kind of expression.
It's going to come another Alastair Morgan meme, I think.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for joining us this evening, and well done.
Thank you very much.
The Metropolitan Police as institutional corruption, that is a landmark moment. And, we wouldn't have that without your dedication. So, it's very inspiring. And
thank you very much.
And very moving.
Very moving.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Alastair Morgan, and we will continue to explore the Daniel Morgan story and its myriad ramifications through our various Byline outlets. Thanks to Byline TV for sharing their audio, and don't forget to support them if you can. Just put Byline TV Patreon into your search engine and that'll take you where you need to go. I'm Adrian Goldberg and this has been the Byline Times podcast. We'll be back next week. Thanks for listening. Bye.